"54% of law enforcement officers killed by firearms in the last couple of years have been killed within 5 feet. Now, 5 feet is one-step distance, touching distance. 74% of law enforcement officers killed by firearms have been killed within 10 feet. This is just a couple of yards. Now, those not killed by firearms, of course, have been killed at 0 distance. No one knows what the statistics are for non-law enforcement personnel, but all the bets are that it's even at closer distances. So we're talking about the fact that most deadly force assaults come at very, very close distances, distances we don't practice shooting at a whole lot. Welcome to extremely close quarter shooting. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to deal with a deadly force assault that you want to respond to with your firearm that's initiated at less than 7 feet. Now, I don't have all the answers to this, but I've talked and conversed with a lot of the experts in the field over the last couple of years, and I've taught this module to law enforcement officers over the last couple of years. And what we're going to do is explore the 8 most common techniques that are used to deal with a deadly force assault at these kind of close distances. 5 feet, 7 feet. Current firearms training doesn't begin to reflect this stark reality. It's getting better. We see more and more shooting and practice at 3 yards or so, but we're still talking 10 feet as opposed to 5 feet in where it really happens. Now, when I teach this module to law enforcement firearms instructors, I always ask them, how many of you are cross-trained in defensive tactics as well as firearms? And by the way, defensive tactics is just a fancy term for martial arts that police use. And usually about half the hands in the audience go up. Then I ask them, how many of you teach both defensive tactics and firearms? And usually less than a quarter of the hands remain up. Finally, I ask, how many of you seamlessly integrate the defensive tactics training and the firearms training? And I think in a couple of years of teaching this, I haven't had more than a couple of hands remain up in the audience. Now, this is critical because when you're talking about dealing with a deadly force assault within 5 feet, you obviously don't have time to get to your firearm without using some kind of empty hand maneuver to fend that attack off first. So you have to integrate the defensive tactics of the martial arts with your firearms training. Now, shooting at these extremely close quarters is actually a very difficult problem. If you start back at the 25-yard line and move in and shoot, it gets easier and easier to get those A-zone hits. What you're basically doing as you move in is the same thing that you did at 25 yards. You're taking the pistol out, aligning the sights, squeezing the trigger. No problem. Up to about 2 yards. And then it gets very difficult. Because if you want to keep things realistic at 2 yards, you aren't just taking the gun out, extending it, aligning the sights, and pulling the trigger. You're integrating these empty hand moves with the firearm. So it becomes a more difficult problem to train realistically from 2 yards in than it does from 25 yards as you start to move in. It's difficult for a couple of reasons. As I said, we have to integrate the empty hand with the firearm. We have to be very careful in training that we don't shoot ourselves because it's very easy for things to get mixed up at this distance. We have to be aware and cognizant of the fact that we're extending a gun towards a close opponent and that we don't get disarmed. So we have to take that into consideration too. This is a critical point to make because, of course, as most of us know, they teach disarms in prison. So if you're going to run into an assailant, chances are he knows how to take your gun away from you. Now we complicate all this. Now what we have is an active opponent as opposed to a static opponent or a static target. He's moving, you're moving, he's charging you. You're trying to get out of the way. Everything's in motion. Complicate it farther with multiple assailants, which is the trend these days. Bottom line is, you've got to learn how to combine defensive tactics with your firearms training. I've actually had some people tell me that, and this is in a law enforcement context, that you should never get that close to an assailant anyway, or a potential assailant. That if a police officer has gotten that close to someone that's going to assault him, he's screwed up. Well, that's bullshit. I don't know what world these people live in, but in the rural community I live in, I'm close to people all the time, and I can't help it, let alone in an urban community or if you're a private citizen. Most deadly force assaults happen up close and personal, yet we do very little firearms training within 5 yards. Now, how did we get to this state of affairs? Well, just as the same bad guys attack police officers as attack non-police officers, the reasons for law enforcement and non-law enforcement personnel are probably pretty similar. The first is tradition. It was good enough for Grandpa, it's good enough for us. Shoot back at 25 yards, bullseye, just fine. It's difficult to train at this distance, particularly if you want to do it realistically, as we discussed before. Your firearms instructor probably doesn't know what to do at these distances. Certainly, they probably don't have the integrated martial arts or defensive tactics and firearms training that they'll need to do it. It's dangerous, as we discussed before. It's very easy to shoot yourself at these distances, so the instructor has to really be on top of things, the students have to be sharp. You need a large backstop, or I should say a high backstop, for most of these techniques. Particularly when you're shooting from the ground, those bullets go up at quite an angle, and a lot of ranges don't permit this kind of training. Why bother to do it? Well, if you haven't been the victim of an assault yourself, or if you're a police officer and the chief's not breathing down your neck to do it, you may say, why do I need to train at these distances? It's a lot more fun to go out and shoot where the marksmanship is a real issue. Well, if you're a police officer, I've got two good reasons for you. Pow versus Margate and Canton versus Harris. These are time bombs waiting to happen, guys. One day, we're going to have to do this. We might as well start now. Perhaps the most interesting reason that we don't do training at this distance is that there's no real well-developed body of knowledge. There's certainly no good statistics about what happens when you try different techniques in this area. All we have right now are the existing techniques that have been historically taught and various anecdotes. Now, an interesting question comes up when we're talking about shooting someone at this close distance. Because you must combine a defensive tactics, that is an empty hands technique, with your firearm, the empty hands technique coming first, the question comes up, why are we shooting this guy? We've just deflected this deadly force attack with our empty hands. Haven't we just demonstrated that deadly force isn't necessary? Well, actually, no. There's a lot of reasons why deflect the attack, you can draw your gun out and shoot the guy immediately. Those reasons are as follows. The number of assailants. There could be multiple assailants, and you still are facing a deadly imminent threat. The assailant could have a weapon that he can turn around and use on you instantly again. A knife, a bludgeon, something of that sort. Disparity of size and strength between you and the attacker could still constitute a deadly force situation. Your assailant could be high on a drug, alcohol, PCP, crack, etc. You could know that this person, this assailant, has a history of violence. You could know that this person has some specialized training. Maybe he's a martial artist or has had some special military training, and you know that. This person could be attempting to disarm you, which certainly constitutes a deadly force assault, because why is he taking your gun away except to use it on you? This person could be drawing his own weapon after you've deflected the initial attack. He could be now going for his own gun, knife, etc. And in general, the answer to that question, why are we shooting this guy, is the same answer that it always is. The totality of the circumstances. What is a reasonable person's perception? Are you in imminent deadly danger? Now, judging imminent deadly danger is usually taught as AOJ, ability, opportunity, jeopardy. We've all heard this. We all know it by heart, I hope. Unfortunately, I don't know about you, but in the heat of a deadly force encounter, even a simulated one, it's very, very difficult to say, does he have the ability? Does he have the opportunity? Am I really in jeopardy? That's pretty hard to do. So what I like to teach people is something I picked up from John Farnham. He says, AOJ, all that reduces to, it always reduces to the question, what do I need to do to protect myself? If you just think of it that way, the whole thing becomes a lot easier. And if you've dealt with this deadly force attack with your empty hands, and what you now need to do to protect yourself is to shoot this guy, then you're justified. Shoot him. A couple of caveats here. There's a few deadly force up-close situations in which you probably don't even want to go for your firearm, at least not initially. You just want to deal with it with your empty hands alone first. The first of those situations is if your opponent has a knife. A knife is an unusual weapon in that it's not power dependent like your fist or strength dependent. All that knife has to do is just touch you a little bit and you'll get cut. If he comes at me with an attack and I decide to go for my firearm, go ahead, give me your attack. I'm going for my firearm. Even if I deflect this initial attack, and even if I've pulled him off balance, all he has to do is just get that knife on me and I'm cut. In this case, he caught me in the arm. He could have caught me anywhere else. So if your opponent comes at you with a knife, give me another attack, please. I suggest you first worry about getting control of that knife and maybe doing some kind of empty hand technique before you go to your firearm. The second situation is if your opponent is going to disarm you. He knows you have a gun and he's trying to take your gun away. Now, if he's going for my gun, the first thing I need to worry about is getting control of this weapon, doing my gun retention business before I worry about drawing down and challenging him. That's pretty obvious. The last situation in which you want to deal with it straight up is obviously if he's got the drop on you. It makes no sense at this point for me to try to outdraw him. Obviously, you need to disarm this person. Quick aside about my theory of gun disarming. I don't like moving the gun to either side because you're going to shoot somebody on either side of you. For the same reason, I don't like bringing the gun around in this way. It seems to me there's three principles you need to adhere to when you're doing a gun disarm. You need to get out of the line of fire. Now when that bullet goes off, if it does, it's going to where you used to be, and hopefully there's nobody behind you. It's probably the safest direction. The second is you need to get control of the firearm, rendering a pistol into a one-shot gun and a revolver into a zero-shot gun, hopefully. And the third thing you need to do is rip the gun out of his hand, working against his bone structure somehow. The best way I found to do that is to just pretend you have an oar in your hand and you're oaring a canoe or something of that nature. So the disarm would look like that. This varies from the disarms where the gun is moving from side to side in that I may or may not be working against bone structure here, and I'm certainly panning the area and shooting, perhaps, the innocent people on either side of me. So those are three situations in which you don't want to go for your gun initially. You just want to deal with it on an empty hands basis. Let's take a look at the speed rock. This is one of the oldest and perhaps the classic technique taught for extremely close quarters shooting. The way this is done, the way it's usually taught, is your feet are square to the target, this fellow's right on top of you, your weak hand, your off hand is withdrawn, you cant your waist and your back backwards, your hand goes for the gun. As soon as it clears leather, you fire. You're not extending the gun, you're firing right from the top of the holster. Let's take a look at that live fire. First slowly and then a little faster. Fumbled that a little bit. Let's do a little faster. And once more. All right, let's take a look at what we've done to this guy here. You see the three shots. Flub this one a little bit under the stress of the extreme speed. You might think these aren't bad shots. They're sort of center of mass, 8-inch circle kind of shots that we usually aim for. But because of the angles that are induced at extremely close quarters, when we go around back, we'll see that they've missed most of the vital organs that will put this person down right away. Coming around to the back here, you've got the heart, the pelvis, the spine. You can see that those shots missed all three of those vital areas. And this isn't even an instantly incapacitating area. It's got to hit the spine or the pelvis to put this guy down like that when he's right on top of you. And this is one of the disadvantages of the speed rock, is it tends to produce these gut shots, which aren't instantly stopping. The speed rock. Feet squared to the opponent, lean back, grab your gun, clear leather, and fire. This technique has been around for an awfully long time, from the early part of the century. And it's come under a lot of criticism, I think some undue criticism perhaps, People say, well, this technique is no good because you're off balance. Well, no kidding, Sherlock. I mean, there's been a lot of foolishness that's come down the pike in firearms training, but I still don't think anyone is deliberately going to invent a technique where you're canted into this position and this terribly off balance for no particular reason, just to say that that's the best technique. In reality, the folks that advocate this technique are a little more specific. They say what this technique was designed for is when your opponent is right on top of you. You can't step back. You can't go backwards. And it's the very last resort. I can't create time or distance in any other way. That's what the technique was meant for. So let's look at it on its own merits. The pros of this technique are that it's very quick. This is about the fastest way to get the gun out of the holster and fire into a person. Another good point about this technique is that it denies the gun to the opponent because the gun is close in a body retention position here. And it's a good technique for when you're belly to belly. It's one of the few things you can do to lean back and fire. Now the cons of this technique are, well, no kidding, yeah, you are off balance. You really are. The advocates of this technique say it's really meant for when you're backed up against something like a car or a couch or whatever. The problem is, I'm off balance leaning over that car or that couch. This fellow is right on top of me, and he's coming at me, and I'm probably going to go ass over tea kettle, over the hood of that car or onto the couch. This doesn't work when my back is against the wall, because I'm not going to be able to lean back. I'm not going to be able to get my elbow back to get the gun out. It doesn't work against a knife. Most of these techniques don't. A potential problem is if the gun is very close to you, if you don't cant it out, you could possibly jam the slide. That's more of a minor consideration. As we saw in the range, this technique tends to produce gut shots, which aren't the most reliable stoppers. And at these extreme close distances, you want instant stops. And another interesting thing about this technique is I'm not doing anything to this guy with my offhand. The way it's classically taught is this hand comes back, the gun comes out, and you shoot. I'm not doing anything to impede his motion. The last thing about this technique, the last con, is that I wonder how learnable it really is. This is a terribly uninstinctive motion. I mean, there's nothing in your life experience that prepares you for this. I mean, this isn't even a bad sex position. So trying to teach this to people and expecting them to do it under stress is perhaps a bit problematic. Now we're going to look at what happens when we attempt to make this technique work under various levels of force. We're going to take a look at each of these techniques at virtually full speed and virtually full power, as near as we can get here today. We don't have fist suits on the defender, so we can't go quite full speed and full power, but the point I think will be made. For these scenarios, we're going to be using a foam brick as the weapon. It's as good as anything as a general purpose weapon at these distances. We're also going to be using the larger man as the attacker and the smaller man as the defender in these scenarios. This is a very important point. Any self-defense technique that you develop has got to work against Mike Tyson on PCP. Having it work against the smaller fellow that just happens to be in your training group isn't going to cut it. It's got to work in a case that a much larger man on the street attacks you. Let's take a look at the speed rock here first. Probably the most popular technique taught for extremely close quarter shooting is the old shove and shoot. It goes by different names. Sometimes it's called the step back technique. Basically what you're doing is you're extending your offhand to stop this fellow's forward momentum, give him something to think about, while you're stepping back, drawing the gun, and firing. Seems instinctive. Everybody wants to do this. One of the nice things about this technique is you don't have to just step straight back, but you can step back at an angle to get off this fellow's center line and get him off of yours. Let's take a look at this live fire. First slowly, then a little faster. A little faster, and with an angle this time. In terms of shot placement, you can see that we're getting nice center of mass hits here with this technique. Because you're creating distance from the target and extending the gun, you're getting your traditional sight picture and your traditional target acquisition, which is the center of mass, where we're all taught to shoot. However, unless one of these shots has hit the pelvis, which it hasn't, or the spine, if we're lucky, this guy isn't going to go down just like that. And at extremely close quarters, that's critical. So this is one of the potential weaknesses of this technique, is that even though you're getting great shots from a traditional perspective, they may not be enough to shut this guy down and stop him from trying to kill you. This technique goes by different names. I call it the shove and shoot. Some people call it the step back. All these techniques go by different names, depending who you talk to. But basically, what we think we've got here are the 8 techniques that are most commonly taught, and what you'll find are, for the most part, just variations on these themes. This shove and shoot technique, when you would use it is when the opponent is not already right on top of you. When you've got a little bit of space to extend your arm and fend him off. And very importantly, when you've got some space to move back to. The pros of this technique are it's very instinctive. I mean, someone comes at you, your first reaction is to put your hands up and maybe try to stop him. So it does key off of some instinctual responses that people have. The other good thing about this technique is I'm now adding some backwards, or if I do this right, some sideways movement for him to deal with, in addition to just trying to clock me. The cons of the shove and shoot or the step back, however, are many. Most important, and this is critical, is I don't know what the heck is back there. I'm stepping back into unknown space. I have no idea what's here. I don't care if I just entered this room and he attacks me. Things could have changed. Dogs could have come in the way. Pets, children. I could have changed my orientation, so now there's furniture behind me. Who knows? Besides, the way this technique is usually taught is you do the shove, take your gun out, and you step back, usually at least 3 steps, sometimes more. That's a lot of distance. I just covered in 3 steps, I don't know, maybe 10 feet. If you look in your own house, you try to find 10 feet where you can back into without falling into things. Unless you live in a pretty big house, oftentimes that's quite hard, and certainly problematic in all cases. Another con of this technique is that it invites tripping. Even if I don't back into something, since I don't know where I'm going, it's very easy for my feet to get fouled up and for me to go head over heels. I'm extending my hand here, reaching for the gun here, pulling it out. If the hand meets hand response, the way we've always trained ourselves to draw, happens, hand is going to meet hand. In this case, muzzle is going to meet hand. I'm going to shoot myself. This is something we have to be very careful of in training. And there are certainly ways to make this safe in training. You know, hand goes high, gun, make sure it goes low. On the street, for real, who knows? This is just a big problem with this technique. Another problem with this technique is I'm relying, go ahead and strike me, for this blow to momentarily stop him. Because we all know he can move forward a bit faster than I can move backwards. So this blow has got to have some effect. Now, have you ever been in a fight and you've hit somebody as hard as you can and it has no effect? Like, yes, we've all had that happen to us, and it's real scary. Now I'm moving backwards. Now I have my backward momentum taking away from the force of whatever blow I'm putting out there. My blows are going to be even weaker. Why do I think this is going to have much effect on him? In a training environment, certainly, he's going to stop, he's going to react, he's going to be nice to me, he's not going to try to break my arm, come right through it. On the street, this guy's adrenalized, probably high on some kind of drug. He can be blasting right through you. What makes you think that this initial shove is going to have any effect whatsoever? Again, this technique, like all the others, doesn't work against a knife. And the last problem with this is that I'm extending my gun, stepping back. He's still coming forward in all probability, and I'm essentially inviting a disarm. I'm presenting the gun to him. Let's take a look at this now at real speed. At realistic speeds and impact, let's look at the shove and shoot. The angle forward technique is a little bit different in that I'm going into the man and I'm angling out at a distance. This is a classic good practice in the martial arts and when you're in a fight is to angle off from the fellow center line. And it would look something like this. If Curtis is swinging at me with this 2x4, I parry the blow, come around him, and draw my gun and shoot him if I need to. Now you'll notice that because I've parried this blow, and if I have a little bit of distance back here, this may actually be a non-lethal force encounter for a brief period of time, for a split second or so. One advantage of this technique is it allows me to assess that, evaluate it, and draw the appropriate weapon if I have options, if I have OC or a baton or some other less lethal weapon on me, if that's what's dictated at this point. I don't necessarily have to shoot the man at this point. Let's take a look at what this angle forward technique looks like live fire. Our tactical Ted here doesn't have arms, so you'll just have to pretend like I will that he does. Now, you can see I was able to acquire a traditional two-handed stance and target acquisition. And what that gets me, as you might expect, is a normal center of mass target hit. Like before, because I didn't hit the pelvis, this man may not go down instantly. I did hit the spine, but that was good luck. The good news here is, because I'm in back of him, because I positioned myself in back of this person, and our momentums are hopefully going in different directions, that even these non-instantly incapacitating hits are going to buy me a little more time than if I got those hits off and he was still coming right at me. So that's one advantage of this technique. The angle forward technique has an awful lot going for it. What have we always been taught to do when faced with a sudden attack with our empty hands? Well, we've been taught to get off the center line of the attack, and if we can, move to the opponent's backside. This technique accomplishes those two things. Those are two very good things about this technique. Another good thing is we're moving into a known area. I can see where I'm going. If that route is partially obscured by a wall, say here or something, I can plan on that as I'm generating my forward momentum so that it doesn't become a real problem. It allows me to do two-handed shooting. Once I get back here and draw the gun, both my hands are free, and I can do what I've trained to do for years, which is acquire a good two-handed grip and shoot. The cons about this technique are that it really is skill dependent. Getting underneath that blow and deflecting it is something that takes a lot of practice. If the blow is coming low, if he's giving me here, doing this kind of deflection is even harder. So it takes a lot of time to train people to do this, time we may not always have. Forward movement towards the attack is not instinctive. Most people want to retreat and get away from the attack as opposed to going into it. And the last thing to say that might be bad about this technique is if this forward route is blocked altogether by something, by another person, by furniture, then it becomes impossible to do. And so if that's the only tool in our arsenal, it isn't necessarily all that we need. Let's see what this looks like when we have the guys trying to do it at full speed. For a skilled practitioner, the angle forward technique is the most likely to work. The elbow technique is a new technique that's getting pretty popular these days. It's a very simple technique in concept, but very aggressive and does require a bit of skill. The elements are, if you drive your elbow into this person as he's coming at you with his deadly force, you sink your center of gravity so you have a good firm foundation, you acquire your gun, take the gun out. Very important, you can't the gun away from you for two reasons. One is so the slide doesn't bite you, and two is so you don't get the slide tangled up in your clothing and have a one-shot pistol here, and you fire, hopefully not hitting yourself in the elbow. Let's see what this looks like live fire here. This is a bit dangerous to practice, of course, because, I mean, all these techniques are dangerous to practice because you always have a hand out in front of you trying to fend this person off. And we'll see what it looks like. I'll do that again in a minute. I don't know if you could see it, but you do get a lot of overpressure and a lot of backblast from the target. There was spray coming right up in my face there. So if you're teaching this to new people, or people that haven't done this before, just be aware they're going to be a little freaked out the first time. Let me do it once again. As you can see, this technique tends to produce nice tight groups. That's because the gun is locked in tight to your body, so you have a felt index. So you know exactly where that gun is aiming. In terms of stopping this fellow when he's coming at you with deadly force, obviously pelvic shots would be better. But like all these techniques, we tend to shoot where we've been trained to shoot since day one, which is center of mass. Most particularly with this technique, because the gun is high, you tend to shoot a little higher than normal. The drive the elbow forward into the opponent technique is becoming the darling of a lot of the progressive schools in this country. And like all the other techniques, it's good news, bad news, pros and cons. One of the really good things about this is that it's semi-instinctive. Whenever you're startled by an assault, you have a startle response. For most people, it's to do something like this. A lot of people train a more intelligent startle response into people, which is this, to cover yourself, from which you can go into an empty hand technique or a draw. And this kind of works off of that intelligent startle response. So if you're training yourself or your students to have a startle response that's protective, this keys right off it, so that's very good. Another good thing about this technique is it doesn't require a lot of movement. He's coming at me, I just drop down, which I'm going to do naturally under stress and under body alarm reaction, drive my elbow up, and hopefully this is going to cause him some pain. Another good thing about this is it covers my head and neck area, which is always a good thing. It's fairly simple and easy to learn. And if I do this right, my draw is under his line of vision. And the other good thing about this is I'm not too likely to shoot myself because the elbow's high and the gun is low. Bad news about this technique is that if my head goes too low, I'm off balance and my neck area becomes vulnerable. If I do it right, this area is exposed, which is a potential disadvantage, particularly if this man has a knife. If there's a disparity in size and strength between our opponents, as I come in here, he can easily defeat this technique and perhaps even topple me over, which isn't too hard to do. In fact, when I was teaching this to a class of police officers once, and as I went into the technique to demonstrate it, the police officer just picked me up and carried me away before I could even get to my gun. So size and strength are a factor in this technique. As an aggressive technique, the elbow technique has a lot to recommend it, but it's still possible to get clocked. Drive forward technique is a very aggressive technique, real good for you martial artists out there, and it's just what it sounds like. You drive into this guy, he's coming at you, you're going back at him. Offense is a good defense. The only thing about it is it's not instinctive for most people. If you don't have a lot of experience, you don't want to necessarily go into where the danger is. It looks like this. You drive into the fellow, draw your gun, and fire. Now these tactical TED targets work really good for this. When we're working with our partners or we're working with flat targets, we throw our hand up there in this manner. Not really realistic. What you're really going for are the eyes, the chin, the throat, some more vulnerable area. This guy's coming at you, boom, fire. Let's see what it looks like live fire. He's coming at me, I'm going to go at him. The drive forward technique is another good news, bad news kind of situation. The good news is that when he assaults me, I'm surprising him with a counter assault. Hopefully this will be effective. It'll be an eye gouge, a chin lift, some kind of powerful blow. I'm also moving into him so I know where I'm going. I'm not backpedaling into an unknown area. The bad news about this technique is that, again, it's strength and size dependent. If he's much larger than me, he may just blow right through my technique, and my technique might not have much effect on him, especially if he's high on some kind of drug. Also, if I don't time this just right, he may come over and hit me in any case. So it's kind of a lose-lose kind of situation at that point. Another thing to watch out for with this technique is even if I execute it correctly, I have the hand meets hand problem. Now, this hand has got to retract and meet my hand where it's supposed to meet it, as opposed to meeting it in a way that I don't want it to meet it. If I do this properly, driving forward with a lot of pressure, I may wind up with a contact shot here, which renders an auto pistol as a one-shot gun, and the slide may jam on me. And the last disadvantage of this technique is that it's not necessarily instinctive. Driving into an opponent, especially with a lot of force, is not instinctive for most people. Most people want to get the heck out of the way. The drive forward technique is a good technique that has offense going for it, but it's still size and strength dependent. Let's talk about dropping to the ground. There's a couple of different ways to get down there and a couple of different kinds of things to do once you're down there. The way I like to get to the ground is the traditional way, whereby you fold your leg, bend your knee, curve your spine, and just roll onto the ground. Real simple. I've taught lots of people to do that. Once you're down here, what do? Well, again, there's a couple of different options. What you don't want to do is you don't want to kick with one of these straight kicks like this. This is fairly easy to come through, fairly easy for the guy on top to deflect them and come through you. What's very hard for this man on top to deal with are bicycle kicks with this circular motion that are done as hard as you can. And while you're keeping the guy off with these kicks, go for your gun, pull in, and shoot when you need to. Now this is one way to do it, to pull your ankles in, rest the gun on top of it on a nice stable shooting platform and fire. Another school of thought says you're going to shoot yourself when you do this at the worst possible time. And what you should be doing as you're kicking, come down to a flat stance and fire. This isn't quite as stable, and you won't get quite as accurate shots, but you certainly don't risk shooting yourself either. Now let's take a look at this live fire. Let's take a look at that shot placement. As you can see, I happen to be aiming a little bit low. I could have been aiming anywhere. But where does that bullet go? Look at the trajectory. That bullet is going up at quite an angle. So if you're practicing this, you need a large berm in back of you. If you're shooting somebody for real, be aware that the backstop for the bullet that's going to over-penetrate is going to be upwards and not straight and back. The drop to the ground technique can be a surprisingly effective technique. you would use this technique if there was no other place for you to go, or if you were involved here and you were falling anyway. If you're falling anyway, you've got to go down. You might as well do it intelligently and have a technique at your disposal. The pros about this technique, the good news about this technique, is that once I'm down here, I can fire in all directions if I need to. Certainly the ground is always available as a place to go. That's another good piece of good news about this technique. Perhaps the most useful thing about this technique is the surprise that it engenders in your assailant. I've done this with scores of police officers over the last couple of years, and to a man, and including me the first time it was done to me. The first time it's done to you, this guy drops out of your line of sight down to the ground, and you're standing there going, what the fuck? What's going on? And you bought yourself a full second or two of his just standing there mentally stuttering. The bad news about this technique is that you're on the ground, and with all the disadvantages that come with that. We've learned over the last 10 years that if it's just you and your assailant in a locked room and you're both unarmed, that the ground fighter certainly has the advantage. But that's not usually the situation on the street. Usually he's armed, there are multiple assailants, and while you're fighting him, they're kicking you in the head. Or if he's not armed, you're armed, and he can be disarming you as you're executing your perfect chokeout. This is not an instinctive technique for most people. Most people don't want to go to the ground, they don't know how to do it, and so they need to be trained. And the only other potential disadvantage to this technique is that when you're down here and kicking, it's easy to shoot yourself in the foot if you don't pull in or put your feet flat on the deck. Dropping to the deck can be a very effective technique, particularly against a single opponent, but it does depend upon the speed and skill of the practitioner. Since we're primarily talking about shooting techniques here, one option that's usually not considered is to forgo the firearm altogether and just deal with this deadly force assault with your empty hands. You're developing your empty hand techniques anyway when you're developing your integrated techniques, that is, when you're developing techniques that integrate the empty hand and the firearm. So the more you develop your pure empty hand skills, the better your integrated skills are going to be. Let me give you an illustration of that. If we're doing the angle forward technique, for example, and I do this, that's my initial empty hand technique, and on the pure angle forward technique, I'd be going to my pistol and drawing. But if he decides to mix it up at this point, if he's not really off balance, he comes back at me with a cross or a backhand, I've got to have the instinctive empty hand skills to deal with that when it comes up. And that may be a possibility. By developing empty hand skills, you're giving yourself a fallback position should one of the integrated skills fail. And we talked about this on the drive forward technique, where when he's assaulting me, I drive into him. And what I mentioned during that segment was that if this technique fails, I may find myself into a hand-to-hand fight. Well, that's true of any of these. If my initial technique fails, I may find myself into a hand-to-hand fight anyway, so I better have the skills to deal with it. Good thing about having empty hand skills that can stand on their own is that they are almost always going to be faster than trying to go for your gun. That is, if the assault comes, having that kind of instant response is almost always going to be faster than trying to do some kind of integrated response that uses the firearm. The bad news about empty hand skills are that they are skills. They require a lot of time and effort to learn. What I'd like to do now is show you a fun little exercise that you can use to impress upon yourself or the people you train that running away may be a viable option. This tactical TED is going to represent the point of initial assault. That is, this fellow is going to attack me at this point. We're both going to start running. I'm going to turn and run. He's going to follow me. Down in this direction. I'm going to be diving behind this car here for cover. We're going to assume at that point that my assailant has reached this position. I'm going to fire on him at this position. Now this may or may not exactly mimic reality, but it's a lot of fun to do and it does get the point across. So what have we learned here? I think we've learned two things. First, we've learned that within 5 feet, which is where most attacks occur, it's very difficult to access your gun. Secondly, I think that we've learned that most of the commonly taught extremely close quarter shooting techniques have some severe shortcomings. Most particularly so since the defender in the scenarios in this video had everything going for him. He had a very short reaction time because he knew what was going to happen. He didn't have to deal with the additional time gap of a startle response. And lastly, he was drawing from a speed, or trying to draw, from a speed holster that wasn't even concealed. So what I think makes sense for you to do is to evaluate the extremely close quarter shooting techniques that we've gone over, and any others you may know of, for yourself. Make sure you do them at full speed and full power, because that's the only way you're going to find out if they work. Make sure you have the appropriate equipment to do it too, such as fist equipment. Any technique in the world, any screwy movement will work at half speed as a defensive movement. Almost anything will work at 3/4 speed. Many things will work at 7/8 speed, but almost nothing works at full speed and full power. So don't fool yourself by doing these kind of half speed, even 7/8 speed simulations. Make sure you go full speed, full power to find out if something really works. When you're evaluating the techniques for yourself, avoid the range effect, what I call the range effect. And that is assuming the whole world is a flat, even, homogeneous, well-lit place. Make sure that whatever technique you choose to put into your arsenal is going to work in a cramped, crowded dope dealer's apartment if you're a law enforcement officer, is going to work in a parking lot or a small alley if you're not a law enforcement officer or even if you are. Make sure you avoid the uke effect, whereby your training partner is working real hard to help you learn this technique, so he doesn't really give it to you full force, full power. He's afraid of hitting you. Finally, you have to avoid the temptation, if you're a gun person, of regarding the gun as the only tool in your toolbox. Gun skills are absolutely necessary in the 20th century for self-defense. We know that. But they alone are not enough, particularly when the attack comes at extremely close quarters.